3,000 miles west of California lies a small coral atoll that marks the center of the Pacific Ocean, Midway. In early June of 1942, the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy is steaming towards this 2.4 square mile piece of US territory. Tokyo commands its fearsome carrier group to seize the strategic foothold, sever vital supply lines and cripple the Allied war effort. But unbeknownst to them, code breakers have intercepted the order and alerted the US Pacific Fleet. Within days, the island that Hawaiians call the backbone of heaven would become the setting for a hellish battle with devastating consequences for Japan's Pacific ambitions. Ranked alongside Trafalgar as one of the most consequential naval engagements in history, the Battle of Midway would turn the tide of the Second World War. I'm James Hansen, and welcome to History Undone, a history show with a difference where we explore how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each episode will focus on a different historical battle, but using modern military analysis, we'll examine how split-second decisions at critical junctures tip the balance with dramatic consequences. All you have to do is watch, share, and subscribe to History Undone with James Hansen on YouTube. Today, it's the Battle of Midway, hailed as one of the most stunning and decisive blows in the history of naval warfare. The vital American victory, which involves subterfuge, courage, and extraordinary luck, would drain Tokyo's confidence and end the threat of Japanese invasion. Joining me to discuss this are the author and historian Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and from the US is the World War II scholar and author of Shattered Sword, the untold story of the Battle of Midway, Jonathan Parshall. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the events of the Battle of Midway itself, Jonathan, I want to start with you. Give us a sense of where we are in terms of the theatre of war in the Pacific. This is, 7 months on from Pearl Harbor. So what is happening? What are the Japanese up to?
Yeah, well, at this point, the war has been going terribly for the Allies. I mean, we should just sort of summarize things. You know, the British have lost in Malaya, Singapore, and Burma at this point. The Americans have been crushed in the Philippines. Java and Indonesia have all been captured by the Japanese at this point. And so they've basically gotten everything that they've gone to war for in the first place in terms of the oil, the rubber, the other strategic materials that are down in the South. So really now the Japanese are trying to figure out what's next. And to their way of thinking, what they need to do is try to bring this war to a close as rapidly as possible. And the only remaining naval assets that the Americans have to their name at this point really are their aircraft carriers. And the Japanese know that those are based in Oahu, in Hawaii. And so Yamamoto, who's the head of Combined Fleet, reasons that if I can just foment some sort of a naval battle, draw those carriers out, destroy them, that will basically crush American morale and hopefully bring us to the bargaining table.
And Dr. Chris Parry, I mean, we've got a map in front of us, and you can see that the Japanese area of influence in the Pacific.
Yes, I think it's quite significant that what the Japanese were trying to do is plug the gaps. So you'll see for the Midway campaign, there's not just an assault on Midway, but also another drive to capture these two islands of Kiska and Attu in the Aleutian Islands as well. I think what's worth mentioning is just before the Battle of Midway, we've had the Battle of the Coral Sea, where the Japanese have tried to probe down towards Australia to get in around the defences here. And what's happened is the Japanese have had two damage carriers and one small one sunk there. The Americans have had the Lexington, the Lady Lex, sunk, and also they've had the Yorktown, one of their three carriers that are operational, severely damaged. And that's had to make its way back to Pearl Harbor here for repairs just ahead of the battle, and then a fantastic feat of engineering. They managed just 6 months after the place has been crippled by the attack in December, get that ship to sea again, along with two other carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, to actually take part in the Battle of Midway. And so the Japanese are very strong, they're probing, they're plugging the gaps, and the Americans have managed down in the Coral Sea to be able to stop the Japanese extending even further down there. What's important, as I said, though, is 2 of these carriers that they would normally use in an operation have been damaged and have had to be repaired, along with having to replace some of their air groups as well.
Well, let's zoom in now and let's focus on Midway in particular, so named, of course, because it is in the middle of North America and Asia. Let's focus on the events of the Battle of Midway. Okay, now before we get into the Battle of Midway itself, I just need to tell you about another really exciting YouTube series that I think you're going to love if you love History Undone. It's done by Times Radio. It's called Superpowers. Here's a sneak preview.
If you like learning about defence, history and global security, you can watch Superpowers on the Times Radio YouTube channel.
OK, let's look directly at Midway now. The battle technically ran from the 4th to the 7th of June, but really the main bulk of the action took place on the 4th. And this map we're using has been made and gifted to us by Jonathan himself. Jonathan, thank you so much. It's a beautiful map. First of all, just talk us through what the Japanese were planning to do on that day at Midway.
Sure. So Admiral Nagumo is the commander of the carrier force here, and he is under the impression that there aren't going to be any American carriers in the neighborhood. And so he goes into this battle on this morning of 4 June with the explicit mission of trying to knock the island of Midway out, break its defenses, shoot down any airplanes that are there, basically get it ready for the invasion that they're hoping to do here in another few days. So he rolls in at about 04:30 in the morning, and the first thing that happens is he launches a very powerful strike against the island itself of 108 aircraft from all 4 of his flight decks. And so they go off and do their thing. And he's not going to be aware of what happens in that strike for at least another couple hours. Simultaneously, he also puts up a fan of 7 scouting aircraft that are basically out looking for the Americans off to their east and northeast. So there's 7 airplanes that go up. One of them goes off a little bit late. And at the same time, though, the Americans are doing their thing. And maybe Chris wants to mention a little bit about the scouting plans on the American side.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really good point because, Chris, the crucial thing about Midway is the Americans know it's coming, unbeknownst to the Japanese.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. The Americans have a listening station, what we would now call a signals intelligence station called HIPO in Hawaii. And this is the outfit that has failed to obviously warn the Americans about the impending attack on Pearl Harbor. So they've got a lot of credibility to make up. But Admiral Nimitz, who is the Pacific Fleet commander after the sacking of Admiral Kimmel after Pearl Harbor, actually listens to these guys. It's headed by a chap called Joe Rochford. And Joe Rochford has picked up that a Japanese attack on somewhere is going to take place in the Pacific after the Coral Sea. And it goes by the sort of name of Alpha Foxtrot, AF. And they can't quite work out where AF is. Rochford thinks it might be Midway. It could be the Aleutian Islands. It could be a breakdown into the Coral Sea again. And he convinces Nimitz and his staff that what they will do is send a message to the garrison on Midway on an underwater cable, so it can't be intercepted, to say in the clear, in a circuit that the Japanese are monitoring, that their water plant is unserviceable. And that's what happens. The garrison do that. The Japanese pick that up. And on a circuit that the Americans are decrypting, the Japanese say there's a problem with the water plant at Alpha Foxtrot. So the Americans know that it's going to be Midway that is the primary target in the upcoming attack.
And that is really so consequential. I mean, John, to bring you in on that, how do the Americans then prepare? How are they braced and ready for the Japanese?
Right. Well, there's a serious scramble going on at this time. As Chris mentioned, the Yorktown is limping back from the Battle of Coral Sea, and they're not going to know until they get her into dry dock whether or not she's actually going to be repairable in time for this battle. A lot of people don't understand that Nimitz was still willing to offer battle whether or not the Yorktown can be repaired. And so he's planning on sending the Enterprise and the Yorktown up to Midway in any case. But his original battle plan has those 2 carriers hanging much further off to the northeast, about 360 miles away from where they think the Japanese are going to show up. In the event, Yorktown does limp back into Pearl Harbor. They put her into dry dock, and they're able to assess that, yeah, we think we can patch her up sufficiently that we can make this thing a go. And so what ends up happening is 72 hours, 1,500 men are just swarming over this ship, and they, sufficiently get her boilers back up to speed so that she can then sally forth. And what ends up happening on June 2nd, just 2 days before the historical battle, Yorktown shows up on station at this place called Point Luck, which is off to the northeast. And Nimitz now knows, okay, I've got 3 carriers on station. My recent intelligence estimates say that the Japanese are only going to be bringing 4 of their carriers to the party. The carrier Zuikaku, which had been damaged to Coral Sea, we know that she's not going to come along. And so at that point in time, Nimitz feels sufficiently comfortable to dial the risk-o-meter up a little bit now that he knows he's got 3 carriers on station, and he moves those carriers a little closer to the battle. And that's where you see them here on this map right now. So, the ships at the tip of the spear are actually fairly well matched in terms of overall power. We've got 4 Japanese carriers, let me think here, how many? 248 carrier aircraft on those 4 flight decks. The Americans have got 3 aircraft carriers, and they've got an air group on Midway of about 120 planes. And so the Americans actually have around 300 some aircraft. They outnumber the Japanese in terms of aircraft, and critically in terms of scouting aircraft. 20 warships on the Japanese side, 25 on the American side. So it's really relatively closely matched.
John, I'll come back to you in just a moment, and we'll talk about the events of the 4th of June. Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think John would agree. There's a very interesting command relationship going on here as well. If you look on the Japanese side, the Japanese commander-in-chief, Admiral Yamamoto, is way out to the west with 5 battleships, quite a number of heavy and light cruisers, and a submarine screen. What's really interesting about the Japanese plan, as they always were throughout the Second World War, they're immensely complicated. And they keep hammering away at delivering the plan, even when they see it's failing. But at the moment, you've got this huge force out to the west, and you've got the carrier group forward. So you've got an interesting command and control arrangement with the Japanese. If you look at the American side, Admiral Fletcher, who's been in the Coral Sea with the Yorktown, is in tactical command. He's in Task Force 17. But in Task Force 16, which basically is the Enterprise and the Hornet, you've got Admiral Spruance, who until recently was the cruiser screen commander under Admiral Bill Halsey. Now, Admiral Bill Halsey was known for very aggressive, almost impetuous actions up to this point. And give you an example, he when he was at the Naval Academy, he wrote a paper. Basically, it was 15 pages long, of which 9 pages was a quotation from somebody else's book. So he's not a very bright guy. He's an American football player. First World War, he's a fantastic destroyer captain, but he's very, very aggressive. He's also got a chief of staff called Miles Browning, who I don't know if John would agree has definite psychopathic tendencies, but is incredibly bright.
He's got some personality flaws.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah,
incredibly bright. He's a great tactical planner. So you've got a very interesting team together. So just before this happens, Bill Halsey goes down with some sort of really irritating skin complaint based on how hard he's been working. He's probably got shingles or psoriasis or something like that.
Psoriasis, one of those two.
He's
laid up in the hospital.
But he's hospitalized. And Admiral Nimitz says to him, who do you want to be in command of these 2 carriers? And Bill Halsey says, well, Spruance is your man. And so just before the battle, Spruance takes over. Now, interestingly enough, Spruance is not an aviator, and this is a big deal. Bill Halsey managed to qualify as an aviator very late in life, so sort of qualifies and gets the kudos for that, but Spruance isn't. So all the talk in the carriers is This is a black shoe admiral. He doesn't understand aviation.
Well, let's come on to the battle itself. John, I want to bring you in, and we're so honoured to have you because you are pretty much the world's leading experts on the Battle of Midway. So you know your stuff when you're talking about this kind of stuff. I'm going to give you a bit of a challenge, though. Sum up the events of the day, in particular the 4th of June, because that's really where the Battle of Midway is won, in about 4 or 5 minutes for us, if you can.
Yeah. All right, here we go. So we've just launched the morning strike. The scout planes are up in the air. The Japanese are kind of waiting. And at about 0700, he gets word from his strike planes from Midway, a quick communication from the strike leader saying, basically, we haven't put this place out of business and we need to hit it again. Nagumo has got half of his aircraft still left in the hangars of his carriers that were a reserve force that were supposed to be armed with torpedoes in case there were any sort of American ships in the neighborhood. And so Nagumo reasons, well, I haven't heard anything from any of my scout planes. I'm not expecting there are going to be American carriers here anyway. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that reserve strike force and I'm going to rearm it with land attack weapons and I'm going to use it to attack Midway again, which I actually think is a very sensible decision. I mean, if you want to keep a high operational tempo, you want to keep hitting the Americans as quickly as possible. But anyway, at 07:15, he makes this decision, okay, I'm going to rearm my planes. Half an hour later, hold the phone, one of his scout planes comes back and says, there's an American naval force out here. I don't know if it's got a carrier or not. And Nagumo immediately is like, ascertain ship types and gives an order to halt the rearming of his aircraft and to switch back to ship attack weapons again. So now you've got this big kerfuffle going on down in the hangars of these carriers, particularly on Akagi and Kaga, to try to get torpedoes back on these planes. Meanwhile, what's going on is the Americans likewise have sighted the Japanese force. There are a series of attacks that roll in now from the island of Midway, American attacks. These are ineffectual. They don't do any damage to the Japanese, but they keep the Japanese, maneuvering and off balance. And so basically up until the time of about 0917 or so, where you see the Japanese take this course off to the northeast again, they're undergoing attacks from the Americans. They're trying to rearm their planes. They're trying to ascertain, are there even American carriers in this group of warships that we found? Nagumo makes a decision that he is not going to try to launch an immediate attack with his reserve strike force because, among other things, his torpedo planes aren't armed yet. And so he makes the decision, I'm going to bring down my morning attack force that has hit Midway. I'm going to get them down in the flight decks, get them down in the hangar decks. Then I'll have my reserve strike force rearmed. I'm going to be moving towards the Americans off to the northeast here. I'll hit them with my reserve strike planes first, and then with my rearmed morning strike plane second. So he starts trundling off to the northeast, and lo and behold, as soon as he does that, he now starts coming under attack by torpedo planes from the American carriers. The first group is VT-8 from Hornet. You can see them angling down from the northeast here. This is one of the most poignant moments in the attack for the Americans. VT-8 rolls in with 15 airplanes. They get hammered by the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. 15 planes in, 15 planes shot down, just one aviator left alive in the water. Subsequently, VT-6 comes in from the Enterprise. Another very, bloody attack on the Americans' part. Many planes shot down, no damage done to the Japanese. And now, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, lo and behold, we have two groups of American dive bombers. We've got a group under the Yorktown that's coming in. This is VB-3, Bombing Squadron 3. And then there's two squadrons coming in from the Enterprise. This is Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6. They've had a bit of a rough go to this point. They've rolled into the neighborhood of where they thought the Japanese were going to be. They find nothing. Their commander, Wade McClusky, makes a decision, okay, I'm going to start doing a box search here and look for the Japanese. He goes off to the north for a little bit, finds nothing, and then lo and behold, runs across this lone Japanese destroyer that is making haste back towards some locale off to the northeast. And McClusky's like, he's going someplace in a big fat hurry. I'm going to follow him.
And sorry to jump in there, John, but that is really one of the key moments, isn't it, in the entire Battle of Midway?
It's huge. Yeah, absolutely huge. It's probably the vital command decision of the airplanes that morning. Meanwhile, Hornets group, we haven't talked about them. There's this sort of infamous fiasco called the flight to nowhere. And you can see their air group moving off to the north here. They are heading basically due west. What ends up happening is the skipper of Hornet, a guy named Mark Mitcher, who is a very senior naval aviator, makes the decision that I'm not going to follow the scouting reports that are being given to me by Admiral Spruance, who's a black shoe, and I don't trust his decisions. I'm going to take my entire air group and I'm going to go off looking for the Americans on my own dime, and I'm not going to tell Spruance that I did that. And so what happens is the entire air group goes off to the west here, and they're going to find nothing. Only that one torpedo squadron, VT-8, whose commander has this vociferous, ugly argument in midair and basically tells the air group commander for Hornet, you don't know what you're doing, and, I'm out of here. Rank insubordination, he goes off, and he's the only one who's going to find the Japanese. Hornet's air group does nothing this entire morning. But we find ourselves now in a situation at 10 o'clock in the morning where we have two separate groups of American aircraft from both Yorktown and Enterprise who have sighted the Japanese carrier force, Kitabutai, are coming in from two different directions. And the Japanese don't have radar. They have no centralized control over their fighters. And so now the table is sort of set for this devastating dive bomber attack that's going to take place against the Japanese at 10:20.
And so talk us through what happens to the carriers, because, Japan outnumbers the US. They've got 4-3, and yet essentially they're all destroyed by the end of the battle.
Yeah, that's right. So at 10:20, what ends up happening is we got these two groups of American planes that come in. The Japanese do not see them. There's broken cloud cover overhead. They don't have radar, as I say. And there's a squadron of torpedo planes in this package with Yorktown. That's VT-3. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol sees those torpedo planes coming in, and they just fixate on them. And so a lot of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol Zeros get sucked into this sort of southeast attack vector, leaving the way open for the two different groups of dive bombers to come in. Long story short, these dive bombers catch the Japanese, and in 5 minutes, between 10:22 and 10:27, they knock out three of the aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. That leaves just one flight deck for the Japanese. That's Hiryu. Hiryu puts up a counterstrike at 11 in the morning and goes out looking for the Yorktown. They find the Yorktown. They dive bomb the Yorktown, and they put her out of business. She's left dead in the water, heavily afire. And within about 2 hours, there's a second, smaller follow-up attack from the Hiryu, this time of torpedo planes. And they're told, go out, find an American carrier that is undamaged, and hit it. And what they don't know is that the American damage control is so good on the Yorktown that in that intervening time, they managed to put out her fires, get her back up to speed. And so when the second strike of Japanese torpedo planes goes out, they find the Yorktown a second time, but she looks undamaged. And so they attack her again. And this time really do put her out of business. She's left dead in the water, heavily listing. Then the final series of actions during this time, Hiryu has been closing the range to the Americans, which is stupid if you ask me. And the Americans find her later on in the afternoon. They still have two remaining flight decks in the Hornet and the Enterprise. They put up a very big strike of dive bombers. They go out and they catch her at about supper time, 1700 hours, hit her with 4 bombs, and now Hiryu is out of business. And basically, this battle is kind of a wrap.
Chris, anything to add?
No, I think one of the things that is significant about this battle is the margins between success and failure are very, very tight indeed. As John mentioned, there's the 5-minute period where the Japanese were totally defenseless and were attacked by dive bombers, but also the fact that the Americans launched at range. This is actually an interesting decision, because in carrier warfare, you get the first strike in, then you're going to win in most cases. So there's a very brave decision by Spruance to launch early, and he does. And it's a tight decision because he doesn't really know how far away the Japanese carriers are. But in the end, you've got very skilled American aviators. They're well trained, they're well led. I wouldn't say they've got the best aircraft in the sky, but they press on, and the dive bombers do their job. And as we found out with Prince of Wales and Repulse, it's very difficult to defend against dive bombers, still less against torpedo-armed planes. What's really interesting with this is the least capable American aircraft, the one that is the torpedo bomber, fails spectacularly to actually land any blows on the Japanese. That's because they're unescorted, but how they contribute to the battle is they draw the Zeros, who are the Japanese fighters, down from height. They fail to see the bombers coming in. They're busy down at low level massacring the torpedo bombers while their carriers and their home plate are being sunk.
Well, there we go. That's what really happened with the Battle of Midway. Now, let's ask ourselves some big questions. Could it have played out differently? And if it did, what the long-term consequences would have been? This is History Undone. We've done the history, now let's undo all the history. John, I want to start with you. I suppose one of the key things about Midway is that intelligence breach, is the fact that the US know it's coming. If they don't know it's coming, does Japan succeed?
That's a great question. In the short term, I think they have more success. I think, they can certainly put some ordnance on target on Midway from their carriers, but I am very skeptical of their ability to actually invade this place successfully. If you look at the correlation of forces, the Americans have got the better part of 4,000 defenders on this thing. They're heavily armed. They even have some light armor on one of the islands. And the Japanese are only bringing about 2,500 troops. And they don't have a lot in the way of specialized landing equipment or really a good gunfire support doctrine for their warships either. I don't think they've got very good odds of even taking this place. But you could put forward a scenario where, let's say that we had no idea that they were coming. They show up unannounced. They manage to invade the place and they capture Midway. Merry Christmas. You've just gotten yourself this tiny little island way out at the end of the Hawaiian island chain that you can't keep in supply very easily, that is within air range of Oahu as well. And that's one of the things actually that Nimitz tells both of his carrier commanders before the battle, that if things go pear-shaped here and this is not looking like it's going to be a successful engagement for us, get out of Dodge, take the carriers and go. And leave this place to the Marines, because even if they can't defend it successfully, the Japanese can't keep it. We can take it back pretty much any time we want to.
Dr. Chris Parry, do you agree with that? Because even if they don't capture Midway, if there wasn't the intelligence breach, you don't have 4 destroyed Japanese carriers.
Yeah, I think you've got to also consider the situation where you might have had 3 destroyed American carriers, in which case that would have given the Japanese quite a lot of scope to go back to the Coral Sea again, to break that line with Australia, the link with America. Yeah. The whole South Pacific campaign would have been prejudiced in that case. But there's another issue here, is the Americans had the chance to lose this battle after they'd won it. Because unbeknown to them initially, there is a huge force of Japanese ships, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and a submarine screen out to the west. It's on the map here, but it's actually further out to the west. And on the night of the battle, Spruance's aviators are saying, right, let's get after what we know is something out to the west. We don't know what it is yet, but we know there's something Japanese out there that's backing up this carrier force. Let's go and get it. At the same time, Yamamoto, the Japanese commander-in-chief in that group, is thinking about reattacking Midway in order to bring the carriers onto him so that the Japanese, who are very good at night fighting, can engage the Americans and sink those carriers. So Spruance, who seemed to have a sixth sense for when there was danger in uncertain circumstances or bad intelligence, never fell for the bait. And interestingly enough, there's a similar situation later in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Spruance yet again does not fall for a situation where the Japanese are trying to bring him on so that they can destroy him. So this is where the substitution of Halsey by Spruance before this battle is absolutely crucial. So the Americans don't go to the west, they hang off back to the east. They obviously have to consolidate their air groups and things like that and think about what's going on. And eventually, Yamamoto goes home. The Americans are left to consolidate here at Midway. But be in no doubt, I think the implications of the Americans losing here and losing their carriers would have been, I think, a renewed assault in the Southeast Pacific by the Japanese to break that link with Australia. And I think more broadly, they would have consolidated on this boundary. And one of the big things that Jonathan and I agree on, certainly, is that the American industrial muscle would have replaced these carriers very quickly. They already had the new fast carriers, the Essex class, on order. They had battleships coming on stream. Huge industrial might would have come back into the fray. However, having said that, if the Japanese are able to consolidate what they've got with all the resources down in Southeast Asia, the ability to roam at will across the Pacific and to build up their industrial base themselves, this is a much tougher fight for the Americans later on. The Japanese ability even to build under pressure, under bombing, is quite great. I mean, they're churning out carriers again throughout the war. And so it'd be interesting to see if they've been given that breathing space, how much resistance there'd been. I have no doubt the Americans would have prevailed in the Pacific eventually because of the huge economic and industrial muscle they were able to bring to bear. I think one of the things that's critical from the Japanese point of view is how many experienced aviators they lost in this battle.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised some really big questions there, Chris, and we'll come on to the long-term consequences in just a moment. John, one thing I do want to ask you about is if McClusky doesn't make the decision he makes, what is the effect of that?
Yeah, right. And there are actually two tactical decisions one after another. McClusky's is first. Yeah, if he does not do his thing, I think you can make the argument that Soryu is going to get put out of business by Yorktown's planes. But yeah, if Enterprise's planes don't show up and knock out Akagi and Kaga, that's a problem for the Americans. We didn't talk about what actually happens, during the 10-20 dive bomber attack. There's actually a communication snafu between McClusky and his second squadron leader, a guy named Dick Best, who's running Bombing Squadron 6. And what ends up happening is two squadrons end up attacking Kaga. And only at the very last minute does Dick Best and two of his wingmen suddenly make this realization that, oh my God, Akagi, the flagship, is getting away scot-free. And Dick Best takes these two other guys and goes over and attacks the Akagi. And with just 3 airplanes, he puts his bomb right on Akagi's flight deck, in the middle of her flight deck, and knocks her out. That's another huge moment in and of itself, because if Akagi escapes that 10-20 dive bomber attack, she has one of the most experienced torpedo plane squadrons in the world. There's a guy on board her named Murata, who's the dude who led the attack against Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor. He's the last guy in the world you want to, make it out of this attack intact. And so what could have happened, if Akagi's air group gets added into Hiryu's air group, that's a whole different kettle of fish too. So as you said earlier, luck plays a huge role in this thing. I'm more skeptical of the Americans losing 3 aircraft carriers. I could see them losing 1 or 2. It's very difficult for me to anticipate that they would have lost 3. But even a draw in this battle is bad for us, because we start this war in a position where the Japanese have got 10 large or smaller flight decks, and we've only got 3 or 4, depending on the date. What Midway gives us from a big picture perspective, winning this battle, is that we sort of drag ourselves up to parity with the Japanese in terms of carrier flight decks. And that allows us then to start thinking about, how do we reshape this war and, go over to the counterattack. That would not have been possible for us if we lose, 2 or even 3 aircraft carriers. Now a counteroffensive is just out of the picture.
Well, let's build on that.
Jonathan, do you think that if Akagi and Kaga had survived those attacks, that the American carriers would have run away, taking Nimitz's advice at that point, rather than actually staying and waiting for the attack?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that certainly Spruance and Fletcher would have fought at arm's length and would have been in a position to, if the battle does start going against them, yeah, let's get out of here. That's the thing about the handling of Hiryu that to me is just so idiotic during the afternoon, is that, Nagumo and his subordinates should have known Hiryu's air power is going to go down into a downward spiral. I want to keep this carrier in position where, yeah, I'm going to counterattack at range, but when things start going south, I'm going to beat feet and get out of there. I do think that Spruance in particular has the ability to place his actions within a larger strategic context and to say, if this thing is not good, yeah, I'm going to get out.
John, I want to ask you about what the reaction would have been from a US perspective had the Battle of Midway played out differently, had it been lost. Let's say they had 2, 3, however many carriers destroyed. I mean, we're talking about 7 months on from Pearl Harbor. How does this change the US approach to the Pacific and the US mindset in terms of the wider context of the war?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, we're all using our little crystal balls here, and the crystal balls get murkier and murkier the further out we go from these events. You can spin this 2 different ways, I think. If we lose the battle, maybe Nimitz gets canned, maybe his boss, Admiral King, gets canned. He's under tremendous pressure at this point, too. But I could see it going either way. I could see the Americans saying, oh, okay, we lost here, but by God, we're going to double down and, we're really going to start focusing on the Japanese because they're clearly a very serious threat to us, and they're threatening our territory in terms of Hawaii. Maybe that ends up redoubling American efforts in the Pacific, and it sucks away resources that would have been used for the fight against Germany. Conversely, I think you can also say maybe the Americans do get demoralized and they're like, we got bigger fish to fry. We're going to turn and face Germany and really put more of our eggs in that basket. I don't know how that plays out. I think you can make arguments for both. Chris, what do you think, Chris?
Yeah, where do you come down on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Americans at this stage would have said, look, we were outmatched 6 months after Pearl Harbor. We were probably looking at a defeat, actually, so they would have absorbed it. I think the Americans would have said, look, we're just going to come back stronger. We're really mad about Pearl Harbor. We're even more mad about Midway. And they almost would have said, well, Midway's a long way away. This is not continental United States. It's not Hawaii. I think an attack on Hawaii after this might have been a problem. Politically.
Do you think they'd have gone after Hawaii, potentially?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Jonathan and I have discussed this. Part of the original Pearl Harbor plan had an invasion force attached to it. So the Japanese were thinking in those terms, and it was always going to be a possibility. What you have to remember is Midway sits at the end of an archipelago that leads down into the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a possibility. I mean, the Japanese always thought big in terms of tactical actions. So that would have been possible. But I have absolute confidence that the strategic stamina of the United States would have swung in here. I think it would have been harder to concentrate on both the European theatre and the Pacific. I think what the Americans would have done is probably gone onto the defensive in the Pacific and said, right, we're holding the line here. They've got a lot of submarines with bad torpedoes, but they've got submarines. They've got a lot of air power. In the European theatre, that has said, stick with Germany first. We'll defeat them. And will hold the Japanese off. While the Japanese, I think, would have been consistently trying to convince the Americans to come to terms. That's how I think it would have played out.
John, can I ask you a question? What would the impact of Japan not being defeated so spectacularly in this battle and therefore being stronger in the Pacific region, what impact would that have had on Russia?
Yeah, okay. Because that's one of the things that the top policymakers like FDR and Churchill are really focused on during this year. 1942 is the critical year in the war, I'm convinced. And the USSR is in terrible shape. And so the last thing that we want to see from an Allied perspective is the Japanese becoming more aggressive in Manchuria, potentially going after the Red Army. That's one of the reasons that we're trying so desperately to keep the Chinese in the war, because we see them as a sump and a magnet for Japanese land forces. So you have to wonder, too, does a defeat at Midway potentially imperil the Lend-Lease shipments that are going across the Pacific in Russian ships, let's be clear, that are bringing a lot of material into Russia? Do we suddenly start feeling a lot dicier about sending that Lend-Lease material over to the Soviet Union at that point, which is hugely important to them? There's a lot of knock-on effects here. The other one I've mentioned too is Australia. We should mention that.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, just on the Russia thing again, of course, there's a very large Russian army facing a possible Japanese assault in the Far East, and that army is moved west after Midway, and of course takes part in the Battle of Stalingrad.
Some of that is mythological, but you're right. I mean, the Red Army does keep substantial forces in Manchuria precisely because they don't want to get stabbed in the back by the Japanese. And so, there's all sorts of scholarship around just what percentage of those forces actually did make it to Stalingrad or not. Personally, I believe that the majority of them were raised from the Moscow military oblast and that sort of thing. But, overall, great point.
Well, that would be a massive what if. I mean, let's just play that out briefly. So let's say Stalingrad, we say potentially Stalingrad plays out differently?
Well, it's not Stalingrad in particular. It's, as Jonathan hints, the ability of the Russians to flex manpower such that they can release manpower for Stalingrad is the issue. Also production, supplies and things like that over long distances. So there is definitely...
I was just going to say, a lot of the raw materials that are coming from the U.S., we're supplying half of Russia's aluminum. And that's, airframes and also tank engines. T-34s run on an aluminum engine block. So, any diminution of that Lend-Lease aid has a direct impact on the combat capabilities of the Red Army.
I mean, I think the big deal about this is I think you look at the way Japanese industrial production was ramping up at this stage with access to raw materials, fuel from the rest of the Pacific. They were a much more daunting proposition for every opponent at this stage. And we've got to remember that, the Japanese had an expansive attitude to this greater Pacific prosperity sphere. I mean, if you go fast forward, it's what China's trying to achieve in the Pacific right now.
Well, let's talk about Australia as well. What are the implications for Australia?
Well, we look at Australia as sort of the launching pad for attacks that can go back and into Indonesia and recapture those regions. And we've kind of taken over the defense burden from Great Britain in terms of guaranteeing Australia's safety at this point. As my friend Rich Frank, another fine Pacific War historian, puts it, anytime the Japanese threaten those supply lines to Australia, it's like stepping on our sciatic nerve, and we reacted very, very vigorously. So, maybe we can't counterattack into the Solomon Islands as a result of having lost at Midway, but if holding the line in the Pacific is now the order of the day, I can guarantee you that the Americans are going to fight very vigorously to preserve that supply line running down to Australia.
Yeah. Chris?
So, I mean, I think the next action by the Japanese would have been a repeat of the Coral Sea. I genuinely think that if you're looking at it from Tokyo's point of view, break that link. As you say, it's a great image, Jonathan, a sciatic nerve. And none of the South Pacific campaign happens if you break that link. And you're committed, if you're an American strategist, to do the Admiral King plan, if you remember, Jonathan, which was essentially go through the Solomons initially as a defensive move, but you have to end up in the Marianas. I mean, what is interesting about all of this, I don't see any situation where the Manhattan Project doesn't happen and Japan gets nuked.
I mean, that's a really big question. John, to get your take on that, I mean, does the war get extended? Or does the bomb still get dropped?
Both. I think that, yeah, if we lose at Midway, that disallows our ability to get this campaign going in the Solomons, which is actually absolutely crucial for kind of gearing up the attritional sausage grinder, if you will, that's going to, grind up the Japanese military. We have to eventually capture the Marianas Islands because those are going to become the bomber bases that are going to be used to drop the bombs. We don't know that the bomb is coming yet. We think that we're probably just going to, conventionally bomb Japan into ruin. But yeah, if we lose Midway, I can't see any way that it does not extend the war's duration by at least 6 months and maybe a year or more. It depends on how soon we can get that counteroffensive moving again.
But it ends still with the bomb being dropped, but just maybe in 1946.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. This is what we love doing on History Undone. Had the Battle of Midway panned out differently, who knows what the world today might be looking like? You could have a situation where Hawaii had been invaded. You could have a situation where the Red Army was undermined. You could have a situation where the supply lines to Australia were severely undermined. And maybe the war dragged on until 1946. That is all we've got time for today. My huge thanks to Jonathan Parshall and Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. We'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. And remember, if there's any battles you want to see us undo, let us know in the comments. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel History Undone with James Hansen on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. That's it from us. Goodbye.